This episode is sponsored by Realtor.com, who wants you to take advantage of your free profile on Realtor.com. By claiming and completing your free profile, adding a photo, and all of the information that puts you head and shoulders above the competition, you're on your way to receiving free leads, helping search engines find you, and staying top of mind with past clients. To learn more about claiming your free profile, go to Realtor.com/profile.
Welcome to the Real View podcast, where Ohio Realtors connect you to innovators and influencers, keeping you with the real view of real estate. Whether you're a broker, agent, first-time homebuyer, industry leader, or just happen to stumble upon our podcast today, you can expect to hear tips, tools, tricks, interesting information, and so much more from the experts in Ohio's real estate game.
Hi, everyone. I'm Michael Edwards, manager of the Ohio Realtor Party, and your host today of The Real View. I'm excited to be joining you to discuss the upcoming convention. Joining me today is special guest and keynote speaker of the RPAC dinner this year, Scott Rasmussen. Scott is the co-founder of ESPN and a prominent pollster in the world of politics. They will be talking to us and giving us a preview of their speaking at the Ohio Realtors Convention. So, without further ado, let's welcome Scott to the show.
Hi, Michael. Glad to be here.
So glad that you can make it today, Scott. So I'll just start with a few questions. Could you please tell us a bit about yourself and your career journey? Because I know that you co-founded ESPN and that you do polls as well. So if you could go into a little bit about that, that'd be fantastic.
Well, I grew up in the broadcast world. I did my first radio commercial when I was 7. Did my first television commercial when I was 12. And I was a hockey announcer in my teens and did my first national television appearance when I was 20, hosting the World Hockey Association All-Star Game. So broadcasting was just part of the world I grew up in. Greatest thrill of my early life, actually of my life, was other than getting married and having kids, but in terms of a professional career, I got to be the MC for Gordie Howe's 50th birthday party. Gordie, best hockey player, greatest hockey player of all time, at least until Gretzky came along, was a childhood idol of mine. So, really, that was fun stuff. And in those days, we couldn't get, there wasn't a lot of sports coverage on television. We learned about this crazy new thing called the satellite. And the genesis of ESPN was this idea that with this new technology of a satellite, we could send a signal around America for less money than it used to cost to send the same signal around Connecticut. And once we figured that out, we had to figure out what to do with it. And August 16th, 1978, so I guess about 46 years ago, that we had a conversation. We got frustrated. What are we going to do with this satellite? And we came up with this idea of all sports, all day, every day. I think that turned out pretty well.
A little while.
Yeah. And then we were funded by Getty Oil. They were bought by Texaco about 5 years after that. And it's when we got out. And I began to move into the political world, started writing about the federal budget issues, got into polling in the very late 80s. And, my media background was perfect preparation for this new thing called the internet back in the early 90s. And I became the first pollster to actually put data online for people to read on their own, as opposed to sending it to a network and let the network anchors go from there. And so for the last 30 years or so, I have been doing public opinion polling in a variety of formats for a variety of approaches. And one really fun thing these days, I now have a weekly television show on Merritt Street Media. That's Dr. Phil's new network. And every Sunday morning at 10 o'clock, I get to talk about the world of politics and what our numbers show.
That is fantastic. And thank you for going into that for us. Before this meeting, I looked you up on X, previously Twitter, and I saw that you have what's called the Rasmussen Report.
Well, Rasmussen Reports is my old company. I founded that company, but left there about a decade ago. and now do my polling through RMG Research. So those are two separate accounts. I wish there wasn't so much confusion about it, but a lot of people do. So that's part of the dynamic. But my work these days done through RMG Research. And if you're looking for it on X or Twitter or Instagram or wherever else, look for RMG Research or at Scott W. Rasmussen.
Sure. So what about RMG Research is your passion?
We poll on a lot of stuff. We poll on whatever's going on in the news. Every couple of weeks, or a couple times every week, we have polls about the presidential race and different issues. And to be honest, while it's interesting, I've been doing that for a very long time. We started a new project within the last year, which is surveying the elite 1%, people who have a postgraduate degree, make a lot of money, and live in densely populated urban areas. It's a very influential group, and their views are wildly out of touch with the American people. So that's been fun. And as part of that project, we just recently concluded the first ever survey of federal government managers. So people that work at the federal government in the DC area and who are at a managerial level or above. And it's, again, the results are a little disturbing in that their views are out of touch with the nation they're ruling over. But it's been fascinating research and really enjoying doing that.
Quick question. Are you optimistic or pessimistic about the info you just shared about the 1% not being in touch with the rest of America?
When we began to find this data, I would say it was stunning, but not surprising. And what I mean by that, the numbers are absolutely stunning. Only about 1 out of 6 Americans think that the federal government should be allowed to censor social media posts. But most members of the elite think the federal government should be allowed to do that. Most managers in the federal government think that should be allowed. So I could say that's concerning. It's a stunning difference, but it's also a little bit of what we expected when we began the project. Overall, I'm very optimistic about the future of America. And the reason for that is because all the data that I see shows that the American people still embrace the founding ideals of freedom, equality, and self-governance.
That's fantastic. And it's good to hear that you're optimistic. I feel like that's a message.
I almost feel like I have to offer that as a confession sometimes because people are so surprised when I say it, but I absolutely do believe that.
That's fantastic. We're going to switch gears just a little bit. When it comes to Ohio REALTOR Convention, what are your plans, or can we have a bit of a preview of what you're going to talk about without spilling the beans on everything?
Well, in the fall of an election year, when a pollster shows up to speak anywhere, the question is who's going to win or what's going to happen. And obviously, we'll talk a little bit about that. This year, more than any in recent memory, or actually more than any that in my entire career, there have been so many late curveballs that I have no idea what's going to happen between now and the time I show up in Ohio in terms of what the news events will be, where the polls will be. Right now the race is very close, but there's a lot of things that will happen between now and then. And usually when I give a presentation like this, obviously it'll depend on the particular events, but I do like to focus on a couple of things beyond just who's ahead in the polls. One, kind of give the audience a little bit of a sense of how they should look at the polls, what they should be looking for to see how things are going. Also like to talk about races beyond the race for the White House, because that has a big deal. This year, as you and I are talking today, the single most important Senate race in the nation is in Montana. And that's because if the Republicans win that race, well, they will control the Senate. If they don't, control of the Senate will depend on who wins the presidential race. So a lot at stake there. We take a look at that. And the other thing that's really important is a lot of people get all excited about what's going to happen on election day. I'd like to talk more about what that means for next year and the year beyond in terms of what policies might be coming and how they might affect the world we live in.
Fantastic. Quick question. How do you guarantee accuracy when it comes to your projections?
Well, guaranteeing accuracy is an impossibility, but one of the things that you have to do is try to be as clear as you can about why you're believing something and what the numbers are saying. A great example that I like to use is in 2018 in the Utah 4 congressional race. I was doing polling for a local newspaper, and Burgess Owens, the Republican candidate, was trailing all the way through the election, and everybody thought he would lose a close race. Our last poll, about a week before the election, showed Burgess up by a single point. And to be honest, the reporters didn't really believe it. I wasn't sure I believed it, but that's what the numbers said. And Burgess was kind enough to win the election by exactly 1 point to make our poll look very good. Now, I could tell you that we polled that race perfectly, but the truth is that poll had a 3.5 point margin of error. We actually told the paper, here's a couple of different turnout models, one in which he wins by a little more, one in which he loses. Too often, people take a poll, and pollsters do this too, and they say, well, our poll shows somebody winning by 2 points, so obviously they're going to win. No, you've got to be a little more cautious about that, a little more humble about the reality of polling. So when we talk about the presidential election this year, whatever the state of the race is when I'm in Ohio, we'll be talking about what do you see, where are the swing states? Where should you be watching? And what could drive the outcome in those states?
This episode of The Real View is brought to you by the Ohio Association of Community Colleges. Ohio's network of community colleges provides accessible training that accommodates the busy lifestyles of aspiring real estate professionals at half the price of a traditional university. With convenient locations in every part of the state, as well as online options, Ohio's community colleges are your smart choice for pre-licensing education. For more details or to start the journey to a real estate career, visit the education page at ohiorealtors.org and then click on the pre-license course locations.
So you have been in media, I believe you said since the 70s. Is that correct?
Well, I did my first radio commercial when I was 7 years old, which was in the 60s. And I've been on TV and doing things since the 70s. Yeah, so very long time.
How much would you say has media changed since then?
You know, it is so hard to describe the change. In the early 70s, I was a cameraman and operated the very first remote broadcast cameras. It was an RCA TK76. And it was huge. I mean, it was like this long. And not only that, you had to have a second person walk with you to carry the tape deck that recorded everything. And now you get better quality out of your phones. Back in the 70s, 3 television networks had 90% of the primetime television audience. In those days, there was only one college football game on every weekend. And most professional sports teams didn't have any coverage of their games. So to even think, it's just a fundamentally different world than anything we had back at that time.
Did you picture media to be what it is today, or is it completely unrecognizable?
I guess that depends on what you mean. We certainly, because of the cable revolution and what we were doing with ESPN, we expected that the media world would become much more micro-targeted, much more, small audience, no longer having these mass audiences. I think one of the strangest things to me about media today, and partly what we're doing right here, this format means we're not married to a clock. We can go a little longer or a little shorter. I used to have if you told me to talk for 2 minutes, I'd talk for 1 minute, 59 and a half seconds, because that's what you had to do. And we don't have those sorts of restraints anymore. And actually, it's a little hard for an old school broadcaster to get used to that.
That's funny. Where are you from, Scott?
Well, all over the place. I was born on Eglin Air Force Base. We lived in Jersey for a while and then in New England, but I spent my summers living with my grandparents at the Jersey Shore, so I consider that home. And now there was this thing called the pandemic a couple of years ago. You may have heard about it. So we left the New York area and now live outside of Dallas, Texas.
Fantastic. So you've been in multiple regions in the United States.
Most of it was in Connecticut, Massachusetts, New Jersey, and then New York City. I mean, so right around the New York area for the most part. Again, until this pandemic hit, chased us away.
Now, how large is your family, sir?
I've got 2 grown children, 1 daughter-in-law, and 1 daughter-in-law to be. My younger boy is getting married on October 6th. So my wife and I have 2 boys and are about to have 2 daughters-in-law. And my wife thinks grandchildren may come soon. But, we don't have much to do about that.
Well, congratulations beforehand, sir. Who was your fellow co-founder when it came to ESPN?
That was my father. My father and I had done some projects together. When I was in high school, we did this crazy thing where we bought the rights to the Western Massachusetts high school hockey playoffs, and he did the play-by-play and I did the color. When we were doing ESPN, that August 16th trip that I mentioned earlier, on August 16th, 1978, my father and I had learned about this satellite technology, and we were really frustrated because we knew it would change the world. We knew it was a really big deal. We were arguing about what kind of programming to do, and you have to understand that at that time, there was nothing like we see today. HBO was on 8 hours a day. It was in 400,000 households. Madison Square Garden sports would come on when the Rangers played a game and they'd go off air. And then when the Knicks played, they'd go back on, and they were just not on air in between. So we kicked around lots of ideas. And on August 16th, we decided to take a day off and go visit my sister for her 16th birthday. She was living with my grandparents at the Jersey Shore that summer. And we promised not to talk business. We got in the car. And of course, we started talking business all the way down. We got stuck in traffic in Waterbury, Connecticut, and we were yelling back and forth. And, back in those days, I thought when fathers and sons argued, the son was always right. I have a different view now, but I finally just gave up. I said, I don't care what you do with it. Show football all weekend. See if I care. And my father, for the first time, didn't yell back at me. He said, that's it. Not football, but sports all weekend long. And I had a yellow legal pad and I was writing notes down. And as we went through this, we kind of nailed the weekend. And then we thought, what do we do Monday through Friday? And over the course of that trip, we decided all sports, all day, every day. And one of the pieces of logic behind it, again, something different media world, back in 1978, the most important thing to determine your ratings was your lead-in. And what that meant was if a show before you had a big audience, you would probably have a big audience. Most people didn't have a remote control, so they would just let it roll. And we said, if we're doing all sports all day, every day, we will beat the lead-in. A sports fan will come home from work and turn on our channel before anything else, and then we'll have them. And that was, we drove to Jersey that day, pretty much ignored my sister on her birthday, got in the car, drove back, and really laid out on that day the plan for ESPN. And it was a remarkable journey. And we didn't really understand, just how outrageous it was, but and how significant it would become. But we knew we were onto something big at the end of that day.
Yeah, I would say you have founded a pinnacle point of American television for sure. ESPN is a household name, and from it to go from just an idea of let's broadcast sports to what it is now is fantastic.
Sometimes it's a little hard to believe, but I got to tell you, when I think of ESPN, I still think of the earliest days. When I speak in Ohio, I will talk about one of the business lessons I learned from the ESPN experience and how that's helped me in my polling career, and maybe even share a story or two about opening night.
Fantastic. We look forward to it. What do you consider your proudest moment in this journey you've taken?
Well, my greatest pride is the fact that my wife and I have two boys who are both better men than I am. I mean, they are our legacy and really proud of both of them. And there's nothing else that comes close to that. In a professional sense, the best night was that night with Gordie Howe. I mean, he had been my childhood idol as a hockey player. And here I was standing in the spotlight with him at center ice, celebrating his birthday. And he was still playing for the team. It was just a remarkable night. So those are the highlights. And, I think the passion that I have these days is I think polling is a very good tool. I think lots of times it has been misused. And one of the mistakes made is that a lot of polls are asked in the language of the political world, the language of a Georgetown cocktail party. And they use terms and words that most Americans don't use. So I like to lift up the voice of the American people and make sure that we're trying to get at their underlying attitudes. That's what keeps me going in the polling world, is that sense of really wanting to lift up that voice.
I'm curious, how did you pivot from sports to political polling? Because that doesn't seem to go hand in hand. So,
Yeah, so I've always been really good with numbers. I mean, that's numbers speak to me. It took me a long time, in fact, to realize that if I just ran a bunch of numbers by you, your eyes would probably glaze over. If I put them in a context that people can understand, I can pass on information. But I just look at raw numbers. So I did all the early budgets for ESPN and defended all those budgets when we went to Getty and their executives. Polling was something that I had an interest in, and I studied a little bit in school, although polling was much different then than it is today. And after ABC bought out ESPN and had to do something else, my first effort in the political world was looking at the federal budget, gaining an understanding of that, again, a numbers thing. And then I began to look at polls, but again, a numbers, I knew how to do a poll in theory. And the more I looked, the more I was puzzled. And the very first poll I did in the late 80s, I asked some questions about Social Security. And they showed that people weren't confident in getting their promised benefits and a number of other things. It was different than what other people were showing because I asked different questions. And I don't quite know how, but the Wall Street Journal heard about it, asked me to write a column on it. And I really just found the niche doing polling. And the big break for me in that world came after I'd been polling for a few years. The internet did come along. And because of my media background, I was able to present the results of our polls directly online to people. And it changed, an awful lot about the world of polling and politics. It's hard. You would not believe if I told you how little polling was done before the 21st century. It was just Gallup would do, maybe a poll every month or two. Most people didn't have, most months went by, most days went by without ever talking about a poll. And obviously the political world doesn't operate like that now.
wow, that is fantastic. Would you say there's a key audience that you like to pay attention to when you do your polling? Or is there any demographic that is going to be very influential in the upcoming election?
There are a lot of key demographics that will be important in the upcoming election, largely in terms of whether they will show up and vote or not. But when I talk about polls, I'm interested in getting people's attitudes. And one of the most important things that I cite, and this always shocks people in Washington, probably won't shock people in Ohio, only 8% of voters talk politics on a daily basis. Most people have a life outside of politics and government. And that's a really important thing to understand because it means that most voters aren't aware of all the internal discussions and the inside baseball discussions that go on in the political campaigns. And that's what causes a lot of the confusion in the political world. There was a legendary pollster named Joe Napolitan. He polled for John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson and Hubert Humphrey, and still can't believe this, but he went to high school with my best friend's father. And so he gave me an hour of his time for free talking about polling when I was still in high school. And one of the things that he impressed upon everybody was that you should never underestimate the intelligence of the American people, but you should never overestimate their level of political knowledge. And I think most political people do the reverse. There's an awful lot of people in Washington that think voters are stupid, and they also think we're paying attention to everything that is said in Washington. So that distinction, the fact that most voters don't live and breathe politics, is probably the one thing that the political world needs to understand.
I agree. Is there anything else you would like to touch on when it comes to previews for your speaking at convention, or what are your thoughts?
Well, this year, more than any other, the event, the world is likely to change between today and when I show up and speak. Most recent elections, by the time we get into mid-August, things are pretty well established. Right now, voters know an awful lot about what they think of Donald Trump. Love him or hate him, they have firm opinions. They're still getting to know Vice President Harris. They don't know much about her. So between now and mid-September, well, we'll be learning a lot about her. The Democrats will have had their convention. We'll see where the race stands. And I expect it'll be a pretty volatile environment still, and should give us a lot of fodder for some good conversation. And I really hope to be able to take lots of questions. Q&A is my favorite part of any presentation. I like to hear how voters are hearing things and how people in the audience, what they're curious about.
Fantastic. Well, I can say that we are definitely excited to have you, Mr. Rasmussen. And I thank you so much for the time you've shared today to talk to the Realtor Party. We very much look forward to having you, and I'm sure they'll have some questions to ask you once they get in front of you.
Great. Well, see you in a couple of weeks.
All right. Thank you, Scott, so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Have a great day.
Thank you for listening to The Real View. That wraps up today's episode. You can keep up with the latest on the podcast at ohiorealtors.org/therealview and on Apple or Google Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen. Have questions, comments, or suggestions? We want to hear from you. Email us at podcast@ohiorealtors.org. We'll see you next time.